Hello and welcome to another episode of Chronicles of New Eden with me, Tryaz. Today's story will serve to help us all remember, before we become too used to the idea of the immortal foot soldier, what it used to take to be one of New Eden's warrior elite. Blood and ash. Hemar watched as Imperial Major Shaish-Khun stopped and trailed his fingers through the cooling remains of the funeral pyre. The Major straightened and solemnly rubbed the ashes he collected into a cut on his forearm. The eyes of the assembled Chimeras were bright with emotion and pride as the Amar officer took part in a ceremony so sacred to them, yet so frowned on by the Imperial command. Shaish-Khun had become an officer in the Chimera Corps as a Cardinal Lieutenant, and, like any Amar officer new to commanding the Chimeras, he had been appalled by the sight of soldiers in the Imperial army rubbing the ashes of the fallen into their wounds. Some officers never got over their distaste for the ritual. Most quickly learned to tolerate and even appreciate it as a critical means of maintaining morale and unity in Chimera units. Major Shaish-Khun was that rarity, an officer of the ancient Amar bloodline who took part in the ceremony itself. In a way, Hemar mused to himself, Shaish-Khun did the fallen even more honour than the Chimeras themselves. It was one thing for the imperial authorities to turn a blind eye to the Minmatar slave troops performing profane funeral rites, but quite another if an Amar officer took part. Shaish-Khun, though, was a hero, and his troops famed throughout the military. The regulars called them Shaish-Khun's Avengers. The Chimeras called themselves Sons of Shaish-Khun, and left it at that. Hemar thought back to the first battle after Shaish-Khun had taken command of Hemar's platoon. It had been a hard one for them all. "Second Hemar, take 2 men and secure building C-32, Lieutenant Shaish-Khun shouted over the deafening roar of the battle, a sound of intermingled vehicle noise, weapons fire, explosions, and the screaming of dropships flying to and fro. In fact, to call it a sound would be a pathetic understatement. Rather, it was a mailed glove of noise and vibration that crushed the senses in its grip. It was battle. War. Hemar raised his hand in acknowledgement and signed to Rinar and Omoristos in their unit's battle language. The 3 men got up into a running crouch and moved down the street toward building C-32, which had once been 3 stories high, but now showed the empty windows of only 1 floor, the jagged teeth of the upper floors protruding at one corner. Immediately, out of the background noise of the battle, the sound of small arms fire erupted, sharp and deadly close. The ground around them showed impacts as the incoming weapon fire tracked them. Hemar, in the lead, signed quickly and dove for cover in the remains of the adjacent building, flattened to nothing only the day before. Rinar and Omoristos leapt after him into the shelter of a bank of rubble, checking themselves for wounds as soon as they were in cover. Hemar looked around. The level block showed no immediate dangers, and the buildings to the rear were under friendly control. The enemy was somewhere ahead. At least that much was simple. Their objective, C-32, seemed quiet, but something told him enemies were present, waiting. He studied the walls and saw that blast damage had weakened a large section of the side of the building. That would be their entrance. Omoristos carried a forced charge launcher, the so-called bubble gun, capable of clearing minefields, field obstacles, and much else besides. Hemar signed, and the big warrior, huge even for a Chimera, surely a purebred Brutor, unslung the launcher and crept along the bank of rubble. Reaching a convenient break, Omoristos raised himself to a kneeling position, shouldered the launcher, and took aim. An instant after the kick of the launcher firing, a shimmering field of force 2 meters across snapped into existence for a split second before winking out. Out of a cloud of dust and debris pushed into the air by the force field, a hole appeared in the side of the building. Omoristos immediately leapt up, slinging the launcher and drawing his short combat glaive in one movement as he ran for the opening. Hemar and Rinar had followed him to the firing position at a crouch, and were running behind him with weapons at the ready. Hemar had his own glaive in one hand and his ionic pistol in the other. Renard favoured his shotgun with the heavy studded choke. Bursting through the settling dust cloud, Hemar was just in time to see Omoristos thrown to the side by a grenade blast. Without stopping to check on his comrade, Hemar charged at the doorway, glaive held low, and gutted the rebel soldier crouching there as the man tried to bring a laser carbine to bear. Kicking the corpse to one side, Hemar backed into the door jamb and brought out one of his own grenades, a monofilament special. He primed and tossed the grenade back down the corridor before turning back into the entry room and pinging Renard, who was checking on their big comrade. Renard looked up, anger etched on his face, and shook his head, his long braids swinging about his ears. The combat medic chopped out some battle language and turned back to the corpse of their comrade, quickly removing useful items. The monofilament grenade detonated as Hemar absorbed what Renard had signed. A frag splinter painted with neurotoxin had taken Omoristos in the face. He hadn't stood a chance. Hemar was lucky to have avoided the blast. Hemar pinged Renard again and, crouching low, went through the doorway, knowing the medic would be following. The air was just clearing from the devastation caused by hundreds of monofilament wire pieces scything through the air. Hemar rushed forward with pistol and glaive, leaping over the remains of the rebels at the end of the corridor and into the next room. He spotted movement and fired a 3-shot burst of ionized lithium in its direction, then dove again for cover. Renard followed, and his shotgun roared death over that quarter of the room. Hemar saw that Renard moved forward and left cover to parallel him. A wounded rebel had been crawling to a window. The rebel had been clipped by Hemar's fire, and the back of his head was blasted open by Renard's heavy shot load. They checked the next 2 rooms quickly, but they were empty. Building C-32 was secure. And Omoristos was dead. Hemar thought back on that battle and its aftermath as he watched man after man step up to the pyre and take on the ashes of the fallen. After that day's fighting, the rebels who had followed the 50 tyrants threw down their arms in hope of mercy. They received only the mercy of a quick execution for their surrender. The planetary capital had been taken by storm because it was too valuable a resource to destroy. A randomly selected provincial city was not so fortunate. Its inhabitants were given a day to evacuate before it was bombarded into white-hot slag by Revelation-class dreadnoughts. The 50 tyrants, at least those dozen who had not already been killed or committed suicide, were tortured to death in front of the planet's loyal holders. The Empire always made sure to teach by example in such cases. Cardinal Lieutenant Tryaz had led his men to such good effect that an entire city district had been secured by nightfall. Omoristos had not been the only chimera to fall that day. Fully a third of Tryaz's platoon had been killed, and the entire corps presence in the city had lost a quarter of its strength. The tyrants had received a lot of help from someone, perhaps from one of the Empire's rivals for dominance of the stars. But they had not prevailed, and the chimeras honoured their fallen as after any battle. Tryaz had seen his first ash ceremony after another officer's unit had returned from a skirmish. This time his own men had fallen, and the chimeras of his platoon noted with gruff approval a change in the attitude of the young officer that night. Hemar was brought back to the present with a jolt as the man next to him moved forward to the pyre. Today's battle had not been like the battle of the 50 tyrants. The sons of Tryaz had been sent to clear out a heretic nest in the depths of the space station they happened to be using as a transit base. It was a matter of convenience rather than needing chimeras to do the job, but the heretics had been dangerous enough, and a sniper had claimed 2 of them. One of the fallen was Renard. Hemar stepped up to the pyre as the previous man stepped away, and looked down at the ashes a moment, remembering once again. Omoristos had been his friend in Junior Subigo, after they'd gone through the final human endurance program treatments in the creche. His death had been a hard blow. Renard here, well, Renard had got him through Senior Subigo. The man had already become a medical adept by then. Renard had healed a break in Hemar's leg that would probably have led to his death during an extended live combat trial out in the wilds of their training planet. This death was another blow. Hemar stooped as the Major had and, cupping his fingers, scooped up the ash and rubbed it into his bare chest. He'd taken no wound today, so he had sliced open a stretch of skin over his breastbone. He took on the ashes of Renard and of Amilpur, the other fallen chimera, just as he'd taken on the ashes of Omoristos so long ago. They were with him forever now, his comrades. Their loss was heavy, but the sons of Shaias-Khun would endure and continue to conquer in the Empire's name. You've just been listening to one of the Chronicles of New Eden, read by Tryaz. All characters, vehicles, storylines, world facts or other recognisable features are the intellectual property of CCP. CCP has granted permission to Tryaz to use these but does not endorse and is not in any way affiliated with Tryaz.
Thank you.